The most legendary war in history.
1,000 ships to be launched for the sake of one woman.
Which began with a beauty contest.
Warriors, chariots, and horses.
And ended in destruction and annihilation.
Whole walls fell over.
A tale so powerful, it's inspired 3,000 years of myth and legend.
He was willing to sacrifice his own daughter.
It's a story of armies divided.
Deception, deceit.
Stolen treasures.
The decline, the catastrophe.
An ancient center of world trade.
There were always enemies enough who wanted to have that place.
And a war without end.
It was a conflict between East and West.
Now, archaeologists, literary detectives, and military analysts have uncovered evidence that the mythological city, destroyed by beauty and vengeance, may in fact be real. This is the true story of Troy. The cradle of Western civilization. Mainland Greece on the west and Asia Minor on the east, with dozens of islands in between. The Aegean Sea links the inhabitants of this region, seafaring adventurers and their legends of gods and heroes. For thousands of years, fortune seekers and archaeologists have been searching these shores for evidence of the Trojan War. And now some say they've found it. Not far off the Turkish coast, an international team is excavating what they believe to be the site of legendary Troy. They claim they're finding evidence of a 5-acre city, complete with palace, streets, and a vibrant center. Outside the walls, they say they have evidence of a lower city, ancient suburbs, surrounded by a defensive moat built to prevent attacks by chariots. Manfred Kaufmann has been director of the excavation since 1988.
If you look around in this area, you see nothing. It's old fields, it's surface, but there was something in here.
Here on this barren plain, Kaufmann and his colleagues envision a fortified city that rivaled ancient Athens, dating to the late Bronze Age, the prehistoric time of the Trojan War. But as in all things Trojan, a conflict rages. Some think Kaufmann's finds are pure fantasy, as credible as the myth itself. Is this the site of ancient Troy? Did Troy actually exist? Why is its legend so enduring?
I think the Trojan War is the original source of so many of our cultural expectations of soldiers, of literature, of human behavior, of the interplay between the divine and the mundane. So much of our cultural tradition originates in the Trojan War that we continue to value it, even unconsciously, as a source of the archetypes upon which we model our behavior.
History became a story, and story became myth, and myth is always elusive. So now we're trying, in a very strange way, to trace our steps backwards, which is not that easy. I mean, it's one thing to dress a history and make it story and then myth, and another thing to undress it. It takes much more pain, and it's more dangerous.
Although some scholars have reservations about the existence of Troy, historians of the ancient world never doubted the Trojan War really happened.
Herodotus, Thucydides, and most other major figures of the Greek and Roman world assumed that the Trojan War was a historical fact.
Classics scholar Robert Garland recounts the tale.
Well, it all began with the gods, as things of great moment tended to in the ancient world, and it began with the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, destined incidentally to be the parents of Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors at Troy. And they invited all the celebrities of the ancient world, all the gods, all the goddesses, except one. They didn't think it was a very good idea to invite discord.
Nevertheless, discord appeared anyway, and offered a golden apple, inscribed with the words, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, claimed the apple and asked Zeus to be the judge. He wisely declined, and instead appointed Paris, the handsome prince of Troy.
And, as often happens, each of the contestants offered a bribe. The one he gave the prize to, Aphrodite, offered him the bribe of the most beautiful woman in the world. But there was one problem. That woman was married. She was Helen, married to Menelaus, king of Sparta.
Paris sailed for Sparta under the guise of official Trojan business.
When Menelaus, his host, was absent, he eloped with Helen back to Troy, and thus unleashed the fury that would become the Trojan War. Menelaus appealed to his brother Agamemnon, who was the overlord of the Greeks at that time. And Agamemnon summoned together all the Greek cities, all the kings, for a war of revenge to right the wrong that had been done to his brother.
1,000 ships were assembled, but the gods caused the winds to cease. To appease the gods, Agamemnon had to make the ultimate sacrifice, the ritual slaying of his own daughter. The winds blew, the fleet sailed, and the war began. The Greeks encamped around the walls of Troy, and for the next 10 long years, heroes were made and destroyed on the battlefield. Achilles, the celebrated Greek warrior, and Hector, the Trojan champion.
As the war began to drag on in the 10th year, and it looked as if there was no end in sight, so the Greeks devised the ruse of the Trojan horse. The Greeks sailed off, and the Trojan horse was left outside the walls. The Trojans broke their walls down to let the horse enter, stuffed full as it was with Greek soldiers. And in the night, as the Trojans were celebrating, down came the Greeks out of the wooden horse, let in their companions, and proceeded to rape, pillage, and destroy. Many acts of vandalism were committed in that time. Priam was slaughtered at his own altar. Cassandra was raped. And the infant son of Hector was thrown from the walls of Troy, his brains dashed out. And even then, after Troy had been totally destroyed, the end was not in sight. As we know from the Odyssey, Odysseus was to wander for many years before he got home. Agamemnon returned to domestic turmoil. His wife, Clytemnestra, had been having an affair with her lover, and with him plotted the death of Agamemnon. So the homecoming of the Greeks was, for them, as devastating as was the destruction of Troy.
But how can such a fantastic story be true? The legend of Troy came first from the oldest writings in Western civilization, the Iliad and the Odyssey, their authorship credited to the poet Homer. But Homer wasn't born until 5 centuries after the war was thought to have occurred, and it's believed he was blind and illiterate.
Homer is our earliest witness for the Trojan War, and yet the Trojan War took place perhaps as many as 500 years before Homer's date. So how reliable can he possibly be?
How is it possible to trust this blind man's tale of lust and infidelity? Human sacrifice, rape, blood, war, destruction, and the ultimate deceit. Is Homer's story the true story of Troy? It's the most legendary war in history. The first great story of Western civilization. For years, scholars believed it was only myth. But now, just off the Turkish coast, archaeologists claim to have discovered the remains of the ancient fortress city of Troy. Is Troy and the Trojan War history or myth? How can our best witness, a blind, illiterate poet named Homer, be trusted? This is the true story of Troy.